Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm Catherine Lutz here at the Watson Institute. We're also live streaming out to the world at large. I know there's a lot of people out there very interested in this topic as well. I have the distinct honor of introducing John Sopko today. If I was introducing him in Washington, he would need no introduction. He might need a flak jacket, but he wouldn't need an introduction. But we're here in Rhode Island, so I think I will tell you a little bit about him, just in case you haven't heard. He's an accomplished lawyer who served as the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction for over 3 years. President Obama called on him for this remarkably complex, difficult, and politically fraught job, which is the job of overseeing the flow of $110 billion in U.S. reconstruction aid to that war-convulsed country, and of identifying fraud, waste, and abuse, as well as lessons learned. The President knew Mr. Sopko had a remarkable wealth of experience to draw on. That includes several decades of experience as a House and Senate staffer conducting investigations for congressional committees, including most recently the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, where he dealt with issues under the purview of the FDA, the Departments of Energy and Commerce, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. He also served on the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations on issues ranging from critical infrastructure protection to nuclear weapons proliferation, from cybersecurity to counter-drug efforts, and from health insurance to organized crime. He's also been a federal and state prosecutor, in which capacity he led the prosecution of the leadership of the Cosa Nostra crime organization. So obviously has no fear. What the president no doubt knew when he selected him on the basis of this history was that he would do the job more rigorously in service of the public interest in both the U.S. and Afghanistan than perhaps anyone before him, and that he was not going to be afraid to confront powerful institutions, and that he would not make life easy for those engaged in reconstruction malpractice. Join me in welcoming Inspector General Sopko to the Watson Institute.
Thank you very much. Oops, I'm going to turn on the computer if I don't want you. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Dr. Lutz. And I also want to thank you, in particular Sue Eckert, and Ellen White, I believe, who has been most helpful to us in setting up today's meeting and the discussion today. Your hospitality and courtesy has been overwhelming, and we really do appreciate it, myself and my colleagues who are here. And I definitely want to thank you for spending some time with me and to share this time this afternoon. I know there are probably far more important things to do. One is probably going home than waiting to listen to me at this time in the day. I promise to make my remarks short and sweet so as to leave ample time for questioning. That may be a little difficult for me because I am trained as a trial attorney and I'm used to being paid by the word. So I will try, nevertheless, to be concise. Why am I here and why should you be listening to me tonight? I'm here because I want to discuss with you what I consider as one of the most important national security challenges facing our nation now and for some time to come. And that is, how do we successfully rebuild a failed state? You only have to look at Syria, Iraq, Yemen, or even the recent news in Paris to appreciate the number and diversity of failed states, as well as the consequences to international and domestic security if not properly addressed. Why is this important to you and to our nation? Here at the Watson Institute, you understand that history has this funny way of repeating itself. And if history is any guide, the U.S. will be working to stabilize another country steeped in insecurity, suffering from widespread corruption, facing major narcotics problems, and with an extremely low level of development. At the same time, I cannot imagine a better and more relevant experience from which to learn than our 14 years in Afghanistan. Because remember, Afghanistan is our longest war. And as I learned just recently over in Germany from the Chancellor's National Security Advisor, it actually is Germany's longest war since the rebuilding or reconstruction of Germany, which I thought they were talking about East and West, and he said, no, we're going back to Prussia. So many of our allies, this is their longest war. And to many of our allies, it is the largest deployment for redevelopment in their histories also. To date, the United States has spent more than $110 billion of taxpayer funds on reconstruction in Afghanistan alone. That's an extraordinary amount of money. For those of you struggling to grasp the concept of what is $110 billion, let me put it in this context. It is more money than the U.S. has spent on reconstruction in any other country in our republic's history. Adjusting for inflation, that $110 billion is more than the United States spent on the entire Marshall Plan for all of Europe. And we still are not done in Afghanistan. We, in addition to our allies, have promised billions more for years to come. The fact that we have invested so much in Afghanistan makes it all the more important that we, quote unquote, get it right as far as the reconstruction goes. And even more important reason to get the reconstruction right is that our efforts there serve our most realistic hope of cultivating a stable nation state that will never again serve as a springboard for international terrorism. Indeed, getting the reconstruction mission right is the best insurance policy that we can buy to make sure our 14-year investment of more than 2,200 American lives and $1 trillion in taxpayer funding for both the reconstruction and warfighting is not wasted. And if we include all the costs, such as the Veterans Administration treatment and other benefits, as highlighted by the well-respected and expansive research of your own, Dr. Lutz, and others, this figure is really closer to $2 trillion investment. Now, for these reasons, I suggest that we must learn from and improve upon our 14 years of reconstruction in Afghanistan. The lessons we learned in Afghanistan will help you, those of you who are our future policymakers and implementers in the diplomatic and national security world, to ensure that U.S. foreign policy is conducted in a more effective manner. Now, taking note of the challenges plaguing U.S. reconstruction policy and the lessons learned from our efforts in Afghanistan is where my small agency, with the odd tobacco-flavored acronym, SIGAR, that's cigar with an S, not with a C, comes into play. Congress created SIGAR in 2008, in part because of the extraordinary amount of funds being spent, and in part because Congress did not trust the then existent oversight mechanism for such a large amount of money. In 2012, President Obama appointed me as the Special Inspector General to replace the original Inspector General, who the Senate forced to resign due to dissatisfying performance. I, as alluded to, am a former state prosecutor and federal prosecutor. I worked for the Department of Justice Organized Crime and Racketeering Section. I'm also a former partner in an international law firm and, as noted, spent 20 years on Capitol Hill and worked for then chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia, as well as Representative John Dingell, who was the longest-serving chairman and member of the House of Representatives at the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Both of those lawmakers made strong, bipartisan oversight the hallmark of their careers. Now, SIGAR is unique in many ways and very different from other inspectors general's offices that you may have dealt with. First of all, we are a temporary agency. We go out of existence when the amount of authorized and appropriated reconstruction funds fall below $250 million. Accordingly, time is of the essence. Now, I will say as an aside, currently there's $10 billion of authorized, appropriated, but not yet spent funds in the pipeline. And I think we are going to intend to authorize another $6 billion for the next year. So, in essence, we could be around for a long while. Secondly, SIGAR is unique because we are not part of any federal agency. Unlike the DoD, state, or USAID IG's offices, we are not housed in any one agency. We basically sit above the agencies and we look at all reconstruction spent by any U.S. government agency. Accordingly, if you look at our enabling legislation, it is replete with language stating that we must be objective and independent in all of our work. The third unique thing about SIGAR is that we have a broad interagency mandate in our statute. Congress gave SIGAR blanket authority to examine any and all Afghan reconstruction activities, regardless of the agency ownership. This is significant because in a conflict zone, like Afghanistan, or any future conflict zone, for that matter, federal agencies will work together in the whole of government approach to tackle key problems. Like any other IG, we issue audits and reports highlighting the problems we find. We make recommendations wherever we can and even arrest people, including members of the military, who steal from the U.S. government. But I want to be clear about one thing. Only SIGAR is mandated by statute to assess the entire reconstruction effort and to make recommendations on the whole of government approach to reconstruction. Since SIGAR was created, we have issued over 300 audits, inspections, alert letters, and other products, totaling more than 600 recommendations that have identified over $1 billion in funds put to better use. In addition, our investigative unit has conducted nearly 900 investigations, resulting in 103 arrests, 136 criminal charges, 100 convictions for guilty pleas, 78 sentencing, and roughly $945 million recovered for the American taxpayer in fines and penalties. Now I want to note three recent products just to give you a flavor of the breadth of our activities. In June, SIGAR raised questions regarding the accuracy of location data used by USAID for USAID-funded healthcare facilities throughout Afghanistan. A key component of the program was the use of geospatial information. That makes sense. And it's to ensure that health facilities were located where they were supposed to be. If any of you go to Afghanistan, you know it's not Rhode Island. They don't have numbers on the door. You don't have a friendly policeman at the corner or a friendly store you can ask, where's the clinic, where's the school, or where's the facility. Our analysis found that coordinates reported for 13 of the facilities were actually not located in Afghanistan. Shockingly, one was located in the Mediterranean Sea, and 30 others were located in provinces or other countries. Accurate location information is important for conducting meaningful oversight of these facilities by myself or by aid officials or aid contractors. Additionally, given the recent tragic events of the Doctors Without Borders Hospital in Kunduz, it is absolutely critical that the U.S. government and Afghan ministries have an accurate geolocation for every facility, particularly clinics and particularly schools built in Afghanistan, which is a war zone. In October, SIGAR published an audit of the U.S. support provided for the Afghan Local Police, or ALP. The audit found that the ALP's effectiveness was hindered by inadequate logistic support, misuse of personnel as personal bodyguards for politicians and warlords, supplies ordered for the ALP were diverted, delayed, or of inferior quality, or heavily pilfered. Given that the ALP is the first line of defense for many villages across Afghanistan, it is vital that the United States ensure that the ALP has the support and supplies they need for their job. And again, given the many press reports that have come out of Kunduz about human rights violations by the ALP in the Kunduz province, which led to the population to actually support the Taliban over the central government, it is critically important, and you can see how critically important for us to do our kind of work and analyses. Lastly, just a few weeks ago, I assume many of you saw in the press a report on the most expensive gas station in the world, the $43 million compressed natural gas station in northern Afghanistan. U.S. taxpayers, of course, paid for that. The Department of Defense's nearly $1 billion program called the Task Force for Business Stability Operations built that gas station, along with other things, to take advantage of Afghanistan's natural reserves and reduce the country's reliance on expensive imported fuel. However, as we noted, the cost of the station far exceeded the cost of similar stations built in Pakistan. According to the International Energy Agency, a similar station in Pakistan costs between $300,000 and $500,000. Yet the actual cost of this station was 8,000% higher than that. In addition, we found out they had never done a cost-benefit analysis of the entire project, which you would think you would do, just basic common sense. If they had done that, they had realized there was no distribution system for compressed natural gas. If they had done that, they had realized that the cost of converting a car to take liquefied or compressed natural gas was equal to or exceeded the annual income of any Afghan. The only people, or the only cars that had been converted, we discovered, were those that the U.S. government had paid to convert. We will have more on the task force for business and stabilization in the near future, but it is indicative, I think, of a bigger issue, and that is, why was TFBSO created? The reason was the Department of Defense was frustrated with the speed of USAID and state to jumpstart the economy. So they took that mission. The question is, that may have been a good motive, the question is, how well a job did the DoD do in rebuilding the economy? I'm old school. I kind of think that economic development should be left for USAID. Diplomacy should be left for the State Department, and DoD should be left with fighting a war. But in this case, they were given the mission of jump-starting the economy in Afghanistan. Now, we have learned from such reports, and many, many others, that reconstruction disasters like these occur when U.S. officials who implement and oversee the programs fail to distinguish fact from fantasy or output from outcome, and operate in a world where personal accountability is nearly non-existent. In addition to this broader overreaching problem, we at SIGAR have identified 4 specific persistent challenges that are almost toxic to our reconstruction mission there. The first is the inability to define requirements, measure effectiveness, and assess sustainability of projects. The second is the lack of coordination within our government, with the Afghans, and with our partners in Europe and elsewhere. The third is poor planning, oversight, and accountability. And the final is corruption. Let's talk about these challenges briefly right now. The first challenge I've identified is the inability to define requirements, measure effectiveness, and assess sustainability. There are many examples I could cite here, but the fundamental problem is that U.S. agencies measure inputs and outputs rather than outcomes. Now, in theory, it should be easy to measure inputs and outputs. You would think the U.S. agencies could count the amount of money they have spent, or the number of students that go to or on a class roster, or the number of clinics or schools built, or soldiers trained. But even this, we have found the agencies are not doing very well. For instance, USAID has struggled mightily at the basic task of the last 14 years of counting the number of schools it has built, with the number actually declining from a high of 680 to 563. It seems that they have somehow forgotten that their mission is reconstruction, not deconstruction in Afghanistan. But more importantly, these numbers don't tell policymakers and don't tell Congress about the effectiveness of the program. That is, whether or not the students are learning, or the health clinics are serving the population's needs, or the soldiers can hold their own when it comes to battle. These are outcomes. And this is what we need to measure to tell us whether the $110 billion in taxpayer dollars has had an impact in making Afghanistan a more stable and prosperous place. Why is that important? Well, if we have to cut programs going forward because we have limited funds, or because of security implications that don't allow our aid officers and State Department diplomats to get out, shouldn't we know which programs are more effective? So we cut the least effective so we can work on the more effective ones? Furthermore, we must also know which ones of those programs the Afghans actually want and can use. Because, as been told to me by a number of Afghans, senior Afghans, the cruelest joke we have played on the Afghans is giving them something they cannot use or sustain. Whether it's a school without teachers or a hospital without nurses, medicine, and doctors. The second challenge to U.S. reconstruction is the lack of coordination with our own government, within our own government, and with other governments and the Afghans. A perfect example is the U.S. government's effort to develop the extractives industry in Afghanistan. And we hear a lot about the extractives industry. This is the panacea to all of Afghanistan's problems, extractives. That's oil and other minerals in the ground. A SIGAR audit has found that the U.S. government did not have a unified strategy for the development of the extractives industry. Instead, that famous Department of Defense task force, as well as USAID, pursued divergent approaches to their initiatives. In addition to the lack of overall strategy, the U.S. Embassy in Kabul did little to coordinate interagency activities aimed at developing the extractives industry. In fact, one senior official told us that the U.S. Embassy, the ambassador himself, in Kabul, was not even aware of a $40 million TFBSO project until the Afghan minister thanked him for it. Ultimately, by not coordinating the various lines of effort, we have undermined our own mission and wasted U.S. taxpayer dollars. Of course, poor coordination does not just extend to U.S. agencies. The U.S. government has also struggled to coordinate with our international allies. And I cite as an example USAID's recent program to assist women called Promote, which included a provision for $200 million in funding from international partners, This was actually announced by the then administrator of USAID on 2 separate occasions. However, as I normally do when I travel to Afghanistan, I meet with our European ambassadors. When I asked them about their $200 million contribution or portion thereof, none of the ambassadors had heard about the Promote program. Later, when we confronted USAID, they said, oh, that's a notional figure, not really real commitments from our allies. Sadly, what USAID told us is indicative of too many of our efforts in Afghanistan. We fail to talk to our partners as we fail to talk to the Afghans. Why, again, is this important? Little to no coordination causes agencies and projects to work at cross purposes, spend funds on frivolous endeavors, or fail to maximize the effort. Poor planning oversight and lack of accountability is the third challenge SIGAR has identified in Afghanistan. One example of poor planning was the nearly $13 million in electrical equipment the U.S. bought for the Afghan electricity operator that was never used. The U.S. funded the procurement of the equipment without considering the operator's lack of capacity to install and manage the equipment without an initial achievable plan for installation. Additionally, I'd like to note that poor oversight can cost lives. In one particular case, U.S. contracting officer reps did not properly oversee the installation of a culvert denial system. Culvert denial system is simply barriers of rebar or metal on either end of a culvert under a highway that are designed to prevent human entry while still allowing water to flow through the culvert. Insurgents, of course, will use the culverts on the highway as an easy way to plant improvised explosive devices, or IEDs. In this case, the contractor submitted fraudulent invoices stating the culvert denial systems had been installed, but in reality, they weren't. And as a result, American and coalition soldiers were killed or wounded by insurgents. It sadly illustrates the simple fact: fraud kills. Oversight is not just about saving money. It is about saving lives, not just coalition lives, but Afghan lives. Now, another lack of accountability is the Indian reconstruction mission is what we call the 64K building. In this instance, the U.S. military built a large modern headquarters facility at Camp Leatherneck in Helmand Province to assist with the surge in 2010. Yet, we found out the general in charge of the surge in Helmand requested the facility not to be built because it was not needed. The request to cancel the building, however, was overruled and rejected by a different general in the rear because he believed it would, quote, not be prudent, unquote, to cancel a project for which Congress had already appropriated supplemental appropriations. The failure to follow the advice of the generals on the ground who said, we don't want it, we won't use it, don't build it, it's a waste, nobody was held accountable. So we wasted $36 million, and we have built a modern building, which jokingly some of the Afghans have told me is going to turn out to be one of the best warehouses for illegal narcotics. You know, ironically, up to this date, I have not found one single person who has been fired, demoted, or even denied a promotion for wasting taxpayers' dollars. And I'm talking about millions. I'm not talking about hundreds or 1,000 or 10,000, because money is wasted in a war zone. Money obviously will. But I'm talking about millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. Cite the example of our wonderful war against counter-narcotics, which has spent over $8 billion. And if you look at any indicia of success, it has been an abject failure. The fourth challenge is the ongoing battle against corruption. As Sarah Chayes, a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, has observed, there is increasing reason to believe that acute corruption contributes to international instability. A study commissioned last year by then ISAF Commander General Joseph Dunford continued along that same thread. His report noted, quote, corruption directly threatens the viability and legitimacy of the Afghan state. The Dunford report also admits that the initial U.S. strategy in Afghanistan not only failed to recognize the significance of corruption, but may also have fostered a political climate conducive to corruption. Again, why is this important? It's important because corruption can undermine every single endeavor we undertake in Afghanistan. If Afghanistan is ever to prosper on its own, and if any of the gains we have fostered are to last, corruption must be addressed in a meaningful way. Now, while SIGAR's work is focused on the reconstruction effort in Afghanistan, the challenges I have identified apply to stability operations regardless of the location. As such, the U.S. government must ensure that the lessons we learn from these challenges and the best practices developed are internalized and eventually institutionalized. Now, as the 20th century philosopher Jorge Santayana once said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. To prevent history from repeating itself, we must study and learn from our missteps as well as our successes in Afghanistan. We will be conducting, by we I mean SIGAR, we will be conducting reconstruction efforts again, and likely sooner rather than later. We cannot afford in national treasure or human lives to continually repeat these mistakes. As such, the U.S. government must ensure that the lessons we take away from the reconstruction mission in Afghanistan and Iraq are institutionalized. To be sure, this process of adaptation requires, even demands, updates to our policy, regulations, and military doctrine to reflect the way we can operate more effectively in conflict environments. Now, we can't stop there. Institutionalization is important, but internalization of lessons learned is equally paramount. Civilian and military training manuals and professional training courses must inculcate current and future policymakers with the lessons of Afghanistan. Now, given our mandate, SIGAR's mandate, we are uniquely positioned to identify the missteps, bad practices, and best practices of our whole of government approach to reconstruction. In fact, General John Allen, the former ISAF commander, highly recommended to me to move out and move out quickly on a series of lessons learned because we were the only agency mandated by Congress to look at the whole of government. With that in mind, and with his urging, I recently developed a lessons learned program at SIGAR. Many of you may have talked to some of my staff already, and hopefully you will talk to them in the future. We are taking stock of the most important issues in Afghanistan reconstruction. Some examples of the reports include one on security sector assistance, one on economic development and social development, another one on coordination of international assistance, another on interagency strategy and planning, and lastly, one on anti-corruption, to name a few. These reports, I hope, will provide practical recommendations to key stakeholders that play a role in designing, implementing, and overseeing U.S. reconstruction assistance. Now, I say I hope, because many people have tried to do lessons learned. The military does them all the time. But those of you in the military and those of you who are working with the military realize the fact you do a lessons learned report means nothing unless it's adopted and put into doctrine and put into the tactics and put into the training that is given to those officers. And I would urge, we all argue that our civilian agencies don't have that type of discipline and are usually not doing that type of thing after a activity such as Afghanistan. You know, Winston Churchill once said, "Let us learn our lessons." Quote, "Never, never, never believe any war will be smooth and easy, or that anyone who embarks on that strange voyage can measure the tide and hurricanes he will encounter." Reconstructing fragile states like Afghanistan is a lot like riding that tide in the midst of a hurricane. It is not an easy business. There are a lot of challenges. Failing to measure outcomes makes determining impacts impossible. Lack of coordination threatens project success and more than likely wastes taxpayer funds. Poor planning and shoddy execution undermines our mission, and theft and corruption by government officials erode any legitimacy or trust conferred by the population. Afghanistan is a case study for anyone hoping to gain wisdom from the world of conflict-affected states. We can learn a great deal from the reconstruction challenges we face in Afghanistan. What we do with these lessons is really up to us. But we should listen to Churchill. We should take note of these challenges and learn from them to get it right in Afghanistan, as well as to get it right in the next reconstruction endeavor, which I argue will happen sooner than later. As I end today's discussion and open it up to the floor for questioning, I want to leave you with one final thought, namely how critical oversight is and will be to success not only in Afghanistan but in any other failed state where we do reconstruction. Oversight is mission critical. And it would behoove you, as well as all policymakers, to investigate and research and study the role of oversight in foreign policy, whether that oversight is done by a congressional committee, the GAO, or an inspector general. Oversight, as I say before, to those in the military who understand that, is and must be mission critical. If we don't learn that lesson, I can safely predict to you, based on my over 30 years of watching Washington bureaucracies, that we will be doomed to repeat history. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questioning. Yes, sir.
I watched a documentary done by Vice News in 2013 called This is What Winning Looks Like, and it talked precisely about the problems with corruption in the Afghan National Police and the Afghan National Army. There was one interview with the United States major. He was managing an Afghan National Police base in Afghanistan, and he essentially acknowledged all the corruption that was going on in the Afghans using pot and sort of skimming off of the fuel allowance that the United States was giving them, frauding vehicle purchases, etc. But he said that was the only way to make them an effective fighting force, that if they just clamped down on this corruption, they would cease to exist as a force, or they would be completely ineffectual in the field. So my question to you is, how do you fix corruption in a country, not just in the country, but when it's so ingrained in the armed forces and the security forces of that country?
You know, that's an argument I have heard time and again, and this isn't denigrated, but we hear it in Afghanistan. I heard it when I was a prosecutor with the Organized Crime Racketeering Section. Corruption works in Chicago. Corruption works here in Providence. okay? But what does corruption really work at? They can build buildings at 16,000 or 60,000% over the cost. What is then the cost of corruption to you here in Providence, or to somebody in Chicago, or somebody in Kabul? Well, that's 60,000% overhead. Could have been used for schools, could have been used for clinics, could have been used for a lot of other things. So I would be very cautious about the slippery slope that, oh, corruption greases the skids, it greases the wheels. Look, there always will be corruption. There always will be corruption in a country like Afghanistan. There'll always be corruption in Providence, and probably Rhode Island, and probably Chicago, and Cleveland, and Youngstown, and places where I investigated organized crime. But what we're talking about is corruption that is so intense, so evil, such a burden that it destroys the central government and its ability to win the hearts and minds of our own people. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about a $10 bribe. We're not talking about, greasing the skids to get your suitcase in. We're talking about stealing of the country. And that is what we got to be afraid of. So I urge you, when you read those articles and when you hear that, oh, Chicago is so much better, under the Daley regime, the streets were always clean, paved with gold. Really? I don't know. I don't want to compare Chicago to Afghanistan. But when I'm told about Afghans, and if you look at the surveys done by Afghans about corruption, they make that distinction. They're upset. They're particularly upset with the current government. They were upset with the last one. They're particularly upset with this current government because they're not doing enough on fighting corruption. The Afghans know about it. They're the ones who are upset. Apparently, the only people who don't know about it, corruption, are U.S. taxpayers who are paying for it. So I'd be very cautious, and I would just say that I'm not urging us to eliminate all corruption. You never can do it. But we got to be careful about this evil that destroys the belief in and support of the central government, because that's our goal. Build a central government that the people support and that the people will then fight and die for. Next question, yes, sir.
Is the current government there because the Afghan people want it or because the U.S. government wants it? Who's supporting it?
As far as I can tell, the Afghan people support the current government. They were very positive after the election. So I'd say that.
Around the country?
What's that?
You can go drive around the country and they're all volunteering to die for their country?
Well, that's a good point. They're losing support because the jobs aren't there. The corruption is still a problem.
Is there anything good that you've done?
Me?
Other than catching the bad guys, is the program actually, are there any things that you can point to that were built, that came in on budget and worked, or is it just like a rat hole?
Successful.
Oh, there have been successful efforts. I mean, I would say that, look, the reality of the situation is the Afghans are better off now than when we got there. There are more schools. There are more clinics. There are more roads. Their military, it has its problems, is better than it was when we came. You do have little girls going to schools. You do have women able to work. You do have some improvements. The ultimate question is, could we have done the same thing with less waste and done it faster? And the other question is any of this sustainable? Because like I say, I go back to what my Afghan friends tell me, that is the dirtiest trick, Mr. Sopko, you have done to us. And again, I don't do aid, I don't do development. I oversee. Do you realize I'm the cop, I'm the umpire, I'm the bad guy, who comes in and throws the penalty flag. But overall, I mean, our people, our aid, our state, our DOD, our contractors have done a pretty good job, but in the course of which we have wasted a heck of a lot of money. we have contributed, like General Dunford in his report, and I think General Allen said in testimony, the biggest threat in Afghanistan is not the Taliban or the insurgency, it's the corruption. So when you pour so much money, so fast, in so small a country, with so little oversight, you're going to have problems. And that's what I think we're trying to highlight. So if we do this again, and as we continue in Afghanistan, we learn from that, we do it better for the years to come, because we're not leaving right away. I know you, sorry I didn't call you first. Yeah.
No, thank you very much for the presentation, and I must say that I apparently have been away from government for so long that I'm not even embarrassed to hear you tell these stories. My question, I guess, relates to this whole of government concept. The question is, who's in charge of each of these missions? Because you've got development professionals who've probably been dragged kicking and screaming into a security environment where they know they really can't achieve results. You've got military people doing development work. You've got diplomats probably ordering the development people to be in areas where they want some resolution of a short-term nature. I guess the question I have is, does whole of government really work in a very troubled situation like this? I'll go from there.
Brian, who is in charge? I can tell you on, the org charts who's supposed to be in charge and how to divide it up. The reality of the situation is that's a problem. We don't know who's in charge. And many times I'm over there and asking people, well, who is in charge of that? It's like economic development. I remember, look, if this is such a priority, and let me just back up. I don't do policy. I know that's may sound like a cop-out for you, but inspectors generals don't do policy. We do process. The president, the Congress, they set the policy. I look and see if the programs and what we're doing actually supports and meets and furthers the policy, or is it hurting the stated policy. The stated policy of the president and Congress is that we wanted to kick the bad guys out of Afghanistan and create a stable, effective government that will keep the bad guys out. So I rate every program in relationship to that. We're troubled by who's in charge. I mean, ultimately the president is in charge, but who is in charge on the ground? And that's why we're very much focused on the TFBSO issue. Because it came with maybe good intentions, because state and aid weren't moving quickly enough, but then DOD's in charge. But then when we asked the Office of the Secretary of Defense to answer our reports, he said, I know nothing about it. I can't answer them, because the program went out of existence 6 months ago. And I thought to myself, God, that's like Truman. In 1945, if somebody in Congress asked him about World War II, he said, what? It's over. Bye. I can't. It disappeared. How could you lose all institutional knowledge on $1 billion program after 5 months? And this was $1 billion program that technically reported to the Deputy Secretary of Defense. This was $1 billion program which was laid out by documents in DOD as their premier program for jump-starting the economy. And this was a program where for 6 months it reported to the Principal Deputy Undersecretary for Defense for Policy, who then has responded to me on 3 separate occasions saying, I know nothing about it. Now you see my world? You're asking the question, who's in charge? Well, here I got a program that reported to the guy for 6 months, and he says, I know nothing about it. Bye.
$1 billion isn't a lot of money.
No, it isn't to DOD, but I think that USAID it would be.
Yeah.
And I think that the average taxpayer it is, I don't know about you, but $1 billion here, $1 billion there, that starts to add up, doesn't it? You could do a lot with $1 billion. You think of it, $1 billion. You think, for example, that $45 million gas station. I mean, somebody jokingly said, I hope they had at least good toilet facilities, What could you buy in Afghanistan for $45 million? How many prosthetics could you buy for the kids and the soldiers who've lost legs? How many lunches could you buy? You know, Afghanistan's horrible nutrition. How much food could you buy for all those migrants? How many other jobs could you create, even if it's digging a ditch or fixing a well for $1 billion or for $45 million? I just ask those questions. Again, I'm just a simple country lawyer, but those are the type of questions I would ask. You know, and why did we do it? You know, we don't even have liquefied natural gas here in the United States. This is what, T. Boone Pickens? I mean, I don't know. Maybe it was T. Boone Pickens that came up with the idea. We can't even get it in the United States. And you're saying we should create an infrastructure for that in a war zone? Again, just a question I ask. Yes, sir.
Thank you for taking on a very hard job
Thank you.
and I think, and a great presentation. I saw you, I thought, dancing over some contradictions in terms of carrying on this kind of work. On the one hand, you are subject to a sunset clause. So by definition, you can't be institutionalized in that, not in the sense of incarcerated, but the other sense.
Mentally, I think I have been into it, yeah.
You also said that no one had been demoted, fired, or otherwise penalized for the transgressions that you have discovered, which means that there's no internalization going on at present. And so I have a couple of questions related to these observations. One, should the sunset clause be taken away? Should SIGAR be reconfigured for the future? Yemen, after the Saudis destroy it, with our help, are we going to be involved in the kind of enterprise you suggest? And if so, should the oversight be simultaneous with the programs? Related question, how about Iraq, which you didn't mention because it's not your responsibility, but since the size of the Iraq expenditures was roughly twice that in Afghanistan, it's not insignificant. And a final sort of frivolous question, since you spoke movingly about girls going to school and improvements that we've made, which I think is true, if you talk to Russians after their intervention, they would make the case that all those things were true then too. Have you exchanged views with the Russians on their experience?
That's a good point. You asked three questions, and I'm getting old and I forget it. Let's start with the first one about my institutionalization. Okay, I have not been institutionalized. That's a policy decision. That's up to Congress and the executive branch, whoever they want to continue SIGAR or come up with another. I'm not an advocate one way or the other. Let Congress decide. It's not my job. I think it's improper for me to lobby for permanent job. I just view that. I personally think that temporary agencies are good. I think we were created for this mission. God, I'm probably the only guy in Washington who wants his agency abolished eventually, but I think we should go out of existence. At some point, the money will go down to a certain level where the normal oversight function of GAO, the DOD IG, state IG, and aid IG, and whatever, can do their function. So I'm a firm believer in temporary agencies, and I'm not questioning that. I know the third one's internalization. Yeah, there's a problem. There's also a problem of surrounding your wagons and pointing out. People don't like IGs making recommendations like this. I'm hoping we can on the lessons learned to get them internalized, because the focus will be different than an audit or an inspection or a criminal investigation, which is more in-your-face, aggressive, attacking somebody. I want to work collegially with the lessons learned groups that are sprouting up in the various agencies to see if we can't get the best practices. And it's almost a focus on best practices. It's maybe a subtle distinction, but tell us what really worked. Now, this is the frustrating thing. And don't worry, I'll stay around for the bitter last question, so I'm not filibustering here. I sent a letter. Early on, I was criticized for being so negative. You know, I'm not supporting the mission. I'm only saying bad things. And I tell people, look I'm just a lawyer. Maybe we only see bad things. Any of you practice law? Any of you know anything about English jurisprudence? You know that a solicitor gives a barrister a brief. And that's what he works from. Now, many congressmen walk around with Bibles or the Constitution. I walk around with these two. This is the 1978 IG Act. This is the 2008 Act that created the Special Inspector General. These are my briefs. My job is included in here. Nowhere else. As amended, as everything is amended. Nowhere in here does it say I should be a cheerleader. It specifically says what my duties are. To identify fraud, waste, and abuse, and to prosecute where I can, and to make recommendations to the President and Congress on reforms. So this is what I deal with. I sent a letter because everybody was criticizing me for being so negative. And I said, well, look, I'm not supposed to be a cheerleader, but okay, I'll try to say something positive. So I sent a letter to the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and the Administrator of AID. And I said, can you give me a list, your top 10 successes in Afghanistan? What's worked? Because I told them, I can either do my lessons learned and whatever from failures, of which I'm finding a lot, or I can do my lessons learned based upon successes. And I said, if you give me the top 10, you got to say why. Because then I know how you're thinking, and then I know what is the mentality, Guess what? No answer. What I got back from DOD is, we're winning the war. What I got back from aid is, we're helping the kids. What I got back from state was, well, whatever aid says sounds good to me. They could not articulate their top 10 successes. So then I backed up. I said, okay, maybe I'm too critical. Maybe not top 10. So why don't you just give me, oh, this is great. One of the aid people said, that's like asking me to say which one of my children is better. And I thought to myself, hold it, I never knew Reconstruction was the Sophie's choice of the U.S. government, you know? So I said, okay, not top 10. Maybe that's too difficult. Just give me some. Response came back, DOD, we're winning the war. Aid, women and children, balloons and kites. They can't decide. So what do I do? What am I supposed to do? Now, Russia.
Well, Iraq also.
Oh, Iraq, we had a Special Inspector General in Iraq, Sigur, not Sigar, and he went out of existence when the amount of funds, well, actually when we pulled the troops out, because then the amount of aid. Now, should he go back in again? I don't know. But again, that's a policy decision. Russia. I have not learned from Russia, although I'm tempted to talk to them, and you're absolutely correct. The Russians can say, hey, when we were there, the girls went to school, the women had jobs, none of this burqa stuff. You know, that's sort of a communist approach. You go back to Soviet Central Asia and see what the commissars did to the population there to bring them up to, you know, the communist ideal. It was pretty brutal, but they got rid of burqas and they got rid of horrible, you know.
Anyway, you might find it interesting because they have a good story to tell, notwithstanding the ideological differences.
Well, you know an interesting thing, and you are gonna get your question. I did get a lecture from the former Russian ambassador when I was in Afghanistan last time. And he is head of the UN Office of Drug Control Policy. Kind of interesting. And he said, Mr. Sopko, in a very deep Russian, Mr. Sopko, you have been saying, where is the anti-narcotics strategy? And now you have one. And I said, well, yes, that's true. It's, the ambassador and, has announced it with Afghanistan. And he said, yes, but it's a counter-narcotics strategy, but you never talk to the Russians, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, yes, the markets. You never talk to the Iranians, you never talk to the Pakistani, you never talk to the UN, you never talk to anybody. So how can you have a counter-narcotics strategy in Afghanistan that is totally in a vacuum? It doesn't deal with the broader picture. So you may have a valid, maybe I should talk to the Russians more. So, Rus? Yes. I'm part Russian, so I can do that. Yes, ma'am, I know you've been diligent in reading.
You said several times that you're not a policy person, that you look at process, but it seems to me that you're in a position to comment on what I see as being a fundamental problem, and that is that we never really decided why we're there and what we're trying to achieve. There are a lot of separate projects, as Ryan Atwood pointed out in his question, to try to figure out how to do a whole government approach. But just the very fact that your office is called, that you're focusing on Afghan reconstruction, how much debate we had about our commitment to Afghan reconstruction and do the people at state and ALB and TLB have anywhere near the same notion? It seems to me that if you're in a war zone, it's inevitable that you're going to have agencies with different perspectives and different goals, unless there is a concerted effort to figure out why we're there. And I think if we go back to the beginning of this particular Afghan conflict, we had a very different objective in the first 6 months, and that morphed into something quite different over time, and there have been lots and lots of different adjustments without any real accountability about what's going on. And now we're focusing on the number of boots on the ground, how much we're going to keep the military, as opposed to why we want to keep them, and how we're going to measure success. And this really troubles me because this is happening all over. I was involved in a lot of other situations like this, Cambodia, for instance, and many of the same problems are there, but it's not just an American problem, it's an European problem, particularly in Afghanistan, particularly at this point. How do we sort out what our real goals are for the time that we have said we're going to have personnel on the ground? Is it going to stop? So this is a fairly broad question, but I'm just curious about your perspective on this, because your mission is to measure the success of Afghan reconstruction. But how do you establish what the end game was, how to measure the milestones along the way?
You're preaching to the choir here. It's an important series of questions you've asked. Again, and I don't intend to do this to avoid responsibility. That is really in the policy arena as to, why we're there and why we even started to get in there, and that's a question I am not asking because it's not my role. I don't think it's a proper role of an IG to do that. I don't question whether we should have 1,000 troops, 5,000 troops, or 10,000 troops. That policy will be stated by the administration. However, we are going to touch on it on lessons learned, because one of the areas we're going to look at is planning and strategy. And what can we learn from? And part of that will be actually laying out all the strategy and plans and how it changed. Because part of these lessons learned reports will actually be telling a story of what happened. And we're going to lay that out, and then we're going to raise questions on best practices or the consequences of what do we learn from that. That's the only thing I can tell you. And I'm not working on that. I have people working on it, and I don't want to prejudice them either way how they should come out. but I think you're asking very, very important questions. This is the debate we should be having. I'm a firm believer in public discourse and debate. I think we should have a debate on this whole thing of who's in charge. Is DOD going to be in charge the next time we do this? And is that proper? There should be a public discussion of that, because that is changing our approach to diplomacy and development. But those are questions, I can only highlight it, but that's really up to the people, up to Congress, you elected them, and the president on having that debate. But I think you're absolutely correct on the questions you've raised. And I'm sorry I can't give you, I have a personal answer, but I don't think it's proper for me to express my personal view on this. And happy to follow. And if you want to work on that, we're always looking for volunteers to help on lessons learned. And I think you have thought out some of these issues. I could add you to the team, that's for sure. And anybody, yes, sir.
Just some short nuts and bolts questions. What percentage of the reconstruction budget is run through US AIP versus DOD or state? Is it 80%, 90%, 15%?
I think it was at about 65% has gone through DOD. Yeah, a little bit more, 68%. Because reconstruction has been defined to cover paying the salaries, buying equipment, uniforms, training, and all of that for the police, Afghan police, and Afghan military. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is, I can look at that. I don't look at the war fighting. The war fighting is the extra $700 billion. That's somebody else.
Two other quick ones. So what percentage of the reconstruction budget is relative to the GNP of
What is the, I don't know offhand what the,
GNP is about 8 billion.
yeah,
And this gets directly to the question of sustainability that you raised several times. The avalanche of money and the things that you bought in many cases may not be sustainable.
I don't have time, in our quarterly report, which is online, which is sort of the answer to all questions, it is probably in here under economic development, but I don't have the number. But I think you're making an excellent point.
final nuts.
Yeah.
Are the contractors, are they the Bechtel's of the world, or are they Pakistani contractors? Or
Yes. Yes, both. We had a Afghan First policy in Afghanistan where we wanted to hire a lot of locals. We have done that, but a lot of times the contract basically goes to an Afghan contractor, but then goes to another contractor who may be a U.S. or international. So that happens. And then, of course, a lot of the money is going on direct assistance. We haven't really talked about that, which means money going, we promised to go up to 50% of all of our funding is going to go directly to the Afghan government for them to do the contracting, and most of the time that is Afghan contractors. Yes, yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Because I just want the point that Margaret Carpenter made, and to push back a little bit in terms of I do process my policy. Every lawyer I've ever had in the executive branch that I always do, I'm just your lawyer, and I'm not doing policy. And every piece of advice had policy in it. Okay, so
Ooh, you're tricky. I
So
knew
it's
you
a
would say
fine
that.
line.
It is a fine line.
It's a fine line. But so, regardless of whether or not we've had the debate, you even stated it, that one of the purposes of the program is to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a springboard for international terrorism. Okay, that's why we're rebuilding it. That's
Yeah.
why our resources are there. That's, I think, what is, to the extent there is a public consensus, that's why we're there. But, juxtapose that with even last night, the PBS special in terms of ISIS in Afghanistan. And so when you can look at it from the perspective of how U.S. funding is spent in Afghanistan, but then take it up a level and look at it from the perspective of what are we doing which is really thwarting international terrorism and what needs to be done. So really just to talk a little bit about that.
Where to start? and I don't know how to start this, but the issue of keeping terrorists out of Afghanistan, wiser people than me have said that if that is the reason we're there, then we could probably invade 90% of the landmass of the world, because they operate in Yemen, they could operate anywhere. So, but that is our stated goal and purpose for being there. On a more specific basis, when we look at outcomes of a program, usually we try to get the agency to tell us what they plan to do there. With DOD in regards to ISIS, part of our strategy has been to make the 300-some thousand Afghan National Defense Force troops and police so powerful that they will keep out the ISIS or ISIL, Daesh, or whatever it's called now. And actually, it's funny, not funny, it's sad in a way, but there's now probably quite a bit of fighting between the Taliban and other insurgency groups and ISIL. It was reported in the press last week that some of these poor kidnapped victims who were actually rescued not by the central government, but were rescued by the Taliban from ISIL. So I mean, it is such a fluid situation in Afghanistan. It's hard for me to respond. I just would urge you all to keep in mind Kunduz. I mean, that's got a lot of press, but I don't know if any policymakers have started to talk about it and what it really means. Kunduz is significant. Now, you realize in the whole Vietnam War, now you hate to draw the comparison between Afghanistan and Vietnam, but you know, the Viet Cong and the NVA never seized a district provincial headquarters until 3 months before Saigon fell. You had a provincial headquarters, you know, government city fall. Now, they didn't keep it, but it fell. I think it's significant. The mood of talking to people when I was in Kabul 2 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago I was there, was pretty depressed. You know, one of the reasons why you're getting so many people leaving Afghanistan is the security situation is deteriorating. And I'll give you a more graphic example of that. When I go to Afghanistan, I fly into the international airport. It is 1.5 miles away from the embassy. I cannot drive that 1.5 miles. I must be helicoptered the 1.5 miles. And that's been going on since February. So it makes you pause. It's a serious situation. I mean, when people think, oh, we're not fighting, yeah, it's serious. There are people out there who want to kill me. And they're not just people inside our embassy. There are other people out there. There are people out there who want to kill any American, any ambassador, anybody associated with it. And the concern is the Afghan government, they're trying, but they can't protect to our to this, not my satisfaction, but to the satisfaction of security experts at 1.5 miles. And we had a tragedy not too long ago. I don't know if you all read about it. Because these helicopters take off, go up, and come down. Remember, they only have to go 1.5 miles. And one went up and caught one of the barrage balloons. One of the, not barrage balloons, but they're balloons that do surveillance. Big eye in the sky. And a helicopter caught it. The blades caught the tether and crashed. And it crashed not too far away from where some of my people were, and some, you know, really brave Americans, you know, tried to rescue, but they lost a number of people. You know, that's one reality we have to deal with. You know, the other reality is how much of the country can anybody see? We do not have eyes and ears in Kunduz. And by we, I don't mean just SIGAR. I'm talking about DOD, state and aid, until you move, forces in. Special forces has eyes and ears, but you don't do it. I can see less of the country now than I could 3 years ago. The aid officers can see less of the country now than 3 years ago. The State Department, the diplomats can see less of the country. Probably the Afghan government can see less of the country safely than they could 3 years ago. Now here's my question to you. If that's winning, what's losing? This is serious. And I think we have to think about that. What does that mean? And how do you carry out diplomacy in a situation like that? There is also a tendency, and I know we didn't chat about it, Mr. Atwood, but this is another serious issue is we somehow in the United States think we can do foreign diplomacy at no risk. God forbid that an American would get killed. Now, we're a little less concerned. I mean, we're concerned, but we know soldiers go in the line of duty. But there's embassy people who are going in the line of fire every day. But maybe it's post-Benghazi. I don't know what it is, but there is this attitude that we can do foreign diplomacy with no risk. That's foolish. And if we keep doing this, the bad guys win. Because how do you ensure no risk? You don't leave the embassy. You sit behind the blast wall and the barbed wire. How do you do foreign diplomacy? How do you monitor a program? How do you reach out to the ministries? How do you know where the money's going? How do you know how good the troops are? How do you know if they're actually building a road or the money is going to pocket a terrorist group? These are serious questions that really need to be asked, and we need to think seriously, not in a partisan manner, but in a serious, because this is, I'm an old Sam Nunn staffer. And Sam Nunn was of the era, and you and I talked about this, where politics ended at the border. This can't be partisan, whether Republican or Democrat or whatever. These are serious policy issues, and I know some of you are students here that you should be thinking about, and the professors should be forcing you to think about this. But, we need that discussion in Washington, D.C., and not only Providence, Rhode Island. How do you do this? If your view is it's risk-free. I tell a story, and I think I told it to some students today at lunch. I go every 3 months. I spend 2 to 3 weeks in Kabul and Afghanistan. I try to get around. I always see the regional security officer, resident security officer, and sometimes he jokes with me or they change. I've gone through so many RSOs. Everybody leaves after 6 months, 9 months. But I remember one time I asked him, do people really want to kill me? And he said, Mr. Sopko, is that inside the embassy or outside? And I said, well, good point. But because I always have a security detail, so I figured, what, is somebody going to come sleep with me tonight wearing a gun? But I asked him about, he jokingly said, and this is some time ago, this is a couple of years ago, the guy said, my only goal, and he was a guy who was about ready to retire, he says, my only goal is to finish this job and retire and not be called before Congress to testify. You understand what that means? Now, that was half in jest, but that meant half of his brain was seriously concerned. He did not want to have to answer for the death or injury of an American, which I admire, especially if I'm that American. But what does that tell you about risk and risk aversion? And if we are that risk averse that a guy will seriously joke about that with an inspector general, he's being honest to me. And I don't want to criticize the guy, he's being honest. But what does that tell us about how we conduct foreign policy? And I know some of you, some of you have served overseas and probably served in dangerous posts, and maybe you've faced similar situations. But that is the reality of Afghanistan right now. And that may be the reality of being in the Foreign Service anywhere in the world. And it makes one wonder if we got a more serious problem than we're talking about. So anyway, yes, ma'am. Oh, I said ma'am. Catherine, yeah.
So, thank you so much for this talk, and I think that, the work has, all the makings of these insights that we can take forward, and I'm wondering if some of what you're identifying are kind of rules of thumb, or that you could identify rules of thumb that might be rules of broken thumb or something that people are using to make the decisions that come out so badly. When you, as you do, ask the question why this happens, why things happen, you don't discern it as like what you mean. I think that people feel like that. And you don't go to the person, you go to the institutional and cultural and say, what institutional and cultural reasons might lead us to keep going this way. And I'm hearing somewhat of the list that you're starting to make. Or that we could make some of the stories, that more is better, so let's throw the money out with the fire hose and on the whole, then corruption happens and other things happen. It's not sustainable, it's not forward. Things like technology is the magic that are not social relations, not trying to understand, the larger social context in which that piece of technology goes. And then you get the rest of it. In other words, there are these things that one could keep looking for, identifying as sort of problems of maybe American hubris in some cases, American affluence, sort of disease of affluence, maybe something that we can control world events, that each of those premises keeps getting the country in trouble. When it comes to doing something like
You're on to something, and we came up with a high-risk list, which sort of listed some of those things. I posed, like, within a year I took the job, I came up with what I called the 7 questions. And I remember some people poo-pooing them because they were so simple. Of course they're asking us questions. Well, we kept finding time and again they did. And, some of those questions were, does the program, and these 7 questions are, if you answer in the affirmative, the program or policy is more likely than not to succeed. And, one was, does the project or program make a clear and identifiable contribution to our interests or strategic objectives? If it does, it's more likely to succeed. If it doesn't, if it's building gas stations somewhere, it probably is not going to succeed. Does the recipient country, i.e. Afghanistan, know of it, want it, and need it? Let's talk to the Afghans. Has it been coordinated with other U.S. agencies and with our allies? If it has, it's more likely to succeed than fail. Do security conditions permit effective implementation and oversight? If it does, you're more likely to have success than failure. Does it have adequate safeguards built into the program? And this is probably more important now since we have fewer places to go outside the wire. Does it have adequate safeguards to detect, deter, and mitigate corruption? That's something. Do we build in safeguards, knowing we're in a corrupt country, knowing we're in one of the most corrupt countries in the world? Does the recipient government, i.e. Afghanistan, have the financial, technical, and political will to sustain it? There's a classic example, $8 billion for counter-narcotics. The Afghans, up to the current government, had no interest in catching dopers or doing anything about it. Hell, it was the main source of revenue. And it's the main source of revenue to the Taliban, too. So that wasn't going to succeed. So why did we even pursue it? You know, other than it made us feel good that we had a counter-narcotics program, which was a total waste. And lastly, do the implementing agencies, have they established meaningful, measurable metrics for success? If they do, it's more likely to succeed than not. If they don't, if they have no metrics for success, other than we're winning the war, we're helping kids, but no meaningful, measurable metrics for success, then it's less likely to succeed. If they have it, it is. So those are the 7 questions, and I think that's where you're getting to. And these are common threads. But let me add, one more thing. What I'm identifying in Afghanistan, the problems, are not indicative of some evil in Afghanistan, or that our people are incompetent or venal or corrupt. What I'm identifying are problems that we face in the U.S. government everywhere. Poor planning. Geez, that sounds like the Veterans Administration. Okay? Poor oversight. Sounds like Veterans Administration, HHS, Social Security, you name it. Poor procurement. Realize DOD has been on the high-risk list, the GAO high-risk list, since 1991 on procurement. Horrible HR system. You can't get the right person. The person doesn't stay long enough, disappears after 6 months. Well, jeepers. You read some of the books about the military, goes back to Korea. We've never really figured out how to redeploy or deploy troops. Tom Ricks, his book on the military, talks about that was one of the big problems at the end of World War II. It was a problem in Korea, it was a problem in Vietnam, and it's a problem today. So what I am saying is, the problems we find in Afghanistan are really examples of the problems with the U.S. government and the way it conducts business and the way it holds people accountable. How many times have you heard and read in the newspaper that they can't fire the guy? You hire a guy and he stays forever and ever. Well, that's in Afghanistan, but it's also at HHS, VA, you name the agency. You know? So just keep that in mind. This is what I'm finding is bigger than Afghanistan. It's only worse in Afghanistan because it's a shooting war. And it's like kids on steroids or at a baseball match or whatever, you know. It just muscles up the problems big time. So, look, I don't want to sound like I'm pushing a political agenda. I'm not. I'm just indicating this is something I've worked on for years on the Hill and saw this problem elsewhere. It's just worse in Afghanistan. So, I think I've put you all to sleep. I got to end on a positive note, don't I? I mean, the positive note is there are really a lot of people working in Afghanistan you should be proud of. And, you know, I'm not talking about my 40 people. I'm talking about people at State, Aid. Mr. Atwood just left. He should be proud of what he left when he left Aid. It's fantastic. The military people are fantastic. They are trying their hardest. But this is not easy. And don't let anybody tell you it's over. It's not over. Because if we cut funding, Afghanistan will collapse. We go cold turkey. You've hit the issue, GDP. They raise $2 billion, takes $4 to $6 billion to pay for the military and police, and another $4 billion to pay for the rest of the government. We gave Afghanistan a government they can't afford. So what do we do now? So that's a policy question. Can't answer it. Bye. Thank you very much.